It's some other Dark Souls with a side of anime for today, because that's what I've got for you. Yeah, so what I was trying to say is that I played Code Vein recently, and, well, now here I am making a video about it. Well, I gotta start somewhere, so how about I just go and begin with the story? How does that sound? Okay, so this might be kinda hard to follow at first, because the game has a lot of background lore that you need to be familiar with before you can really start to understand the story, but the game doesn't really tell you all about that stuff until certain points in the game, so I'm just going to go ahead and tackle them as I see them become relevant. So you're kind of just there, relaxing in this desolate wasteland along with this other girl, and you kind of look like you're about to go insane. So you get up, you walk over to this tree, and then you bleed all over it, and suddenly the tree grows back to life for some reason. And then as you're taking a nap, these two jerks come over and they decide to essentially force you to come with them. So after waking up in a cage, talking to this guy, and putting on a gas mask, you go out into the world because these jerks are actually forcing you to work as a slave for them. So along with this guy, his name is Oliver, say hi, you get brought to this giant hole in the ground and then they just kick you down there. So your job is to explore these underground tunnels and whatnot and find some blood beads. So anyway, you move along and then some guy comes over and smacks Oliver's mask, so he decides to just slump there and tell you to go it alone. So you keep going, you meet this guy, you bleed on another tree for good measure, and then all of a sudden you're outside and Oliver is eating some people and then he tries to kill you. Then he drops a weird crystal on the ground, so you pick it up and all of a sudden you're transported into his memories. So after a quick walk through that, you come back to the real world. Well, anyway, the guy has no idea what's going on, but he thinks you might be able to help him, so he asks you for exactly that, and then he introduces himself as Louis. So he takes you back to his hideout, this old destroyed church, and he asks for your help because he thinks you might be able to help him locate the source of the blood beads. Okay, it might be time I start explaining all these concepts, so here's the deal. You're actually not a real human, you're actually what's called a revenant. So revenants are basically corpses that were brought back to life by the use of something called a boar parasite that was injected straight into them. Boar parasites are injected straight into the heart and they're able to rematerialize the body at any time, so as long as the revenant's heart is still well and good, then the boar parasite can revive them as much as they want. However, revenants also have to contend with loss, which happens if they don't drink enough human blood, which they usually do by either siphoning the blood from humans straight up or using blood beads. When that happens, the revenant turns into a lost and he becomes hostile to pretty much everything, and he also becomes completely immortal because the boar parasite can no longer be destroyed. So the problem is that right now all of the blood springs are drying up and they're no longer producing any blood beads, and the miasma, which accelerates the thirst for blood, is no longer being able to be repelled by all the missile because they're being deactivated for some reason. Fortunately, you, because of your super protagonist powers, are able to both rejuvenate the blood springs as well as reactivate all the missile laying around, which is why Louis wants your help in searching for the source of the blood spring so that he can get blood beads to grow again and satisfy the hunger of all revenants and whatnot. So you team up with Louis and his merry band of friends in order to find some blood springs that'll allow you to find the way to the source. So you mess around this ravine kind of area and you also meet this guy who they call him the Hunter, and apparently he hunts and kills revenants, so maybe be careful around that guy. There's also this giant pit of water where you come across this girl and her little brother who gets killed by said hunter. And after that the girl tells you to find this statue of the goddess, and so you go ahead and do just that, and it leads you to this giant cathedral place. So you make your way through the cathedral, you beat up this guy, you come face to face with this abomination who you also beat up, and then you find yourself in its memories, and then you meet this woman named Aurora, who is actually the successor. Okay, so for some added context, some undefined number of years ago, there was an event called the Great Collapse that happened that basically unleashed some giant monsters all over the place. And it was at this point that revenants started being made in order to combat those monsters, but there was also something called Project Queen, which aimed to essentially create a super powerful and actually immortal revenant that could never die no matter the circumstances. The Project Queen candidate was a woman named Cruz, and well, the project itself was half success, half failure. It was a success in the sense that she did indeed become super strong and immortal, but it was also a failure because she couldn't handle all the pain and torment that came with the experiment, so she kind of went mad and she started killing everyone. So with that mess on their hands, the Operation Queenslayer officially began, which created more revenants in order to actually stop the queen. And as it turns out, all those years back, you were actually a part of Operation Queenslayer along with your teammate Jack. Yeah, the hunter guy. So after killing this dude, you get the chance to actually meet the queen, and she comes over to slap your ass. So you and Jack get your asses slapped around a little, but then this guy called Gregorio comes over to help you. So you launch another unsuccessful attack on the queen, which actually results in you getting your mask knocked off. So Jack throws his sword at the queen, which does absolutely nothing, but it does give you the opportunity to stab her in the stomach with your giant claw arm thing. Congrats, you've killed the queen, now you're going insane, so Jack just outright kills you to ensure that doesn't happen. However, because the queen is immortal, she's actually able to come back to life still somehow, so that means her body had to be destroyed, basically, and split into multiple parts called relics. These relics were then put into revenants with high enough compatibility to prevent them from getting back together and allowing the queen to be reborn. The people with relics in them are the successors, and because the relics are corrupting them, they're essentially all going insane. So anyway, Aurora tells Louis to go down the stairs in order to see someone that's waiting for him down there. That someone is Karen, Louis' sister, who is actually the successor of the heart now, so she's the one responsible for creating all the blood beads. So Louis loses his mind a little, and after giving him some time, he eventually comes back to his senses and is ready to go again, promising Karen that he'll come back eventually, but that's a lie, you can forget about her for the rest of the game. So now your job is to find all of the successors, starting with the one that resides in this big snowy mountain. So afterwards you go back to base, and then the woman that used to be with Jack, who's the hunter, is now suddenly barging in and asking for your help. She introduces herself as Eva and asks you to help Jack because she and him were attacked by some guy. So you go into this cave and you meet Jack, who tells you that he's actually keeping an eye on all the successors, trying to find out which ones are about to frenzy and killing them before they can do so. Anyway, Jack reveals that one of the successors, called Mido, managed to break out of his crypt and attack him. This makes Yakumo mad, and he tells you guys that you should tag along with Jack just in case things get bad. So you get to the crypt and you fight this guy who drops his vestige upon dying, and his memories reveal that he was actually a friend of Yakumo's who was experimented on by Mido. So anyway, you guys keep running after Mido, so you go into the city of Falling Flame, which has, as you guessed, fire all over the place. At the end, you run into the successor of the Claw, this giant fiery cat thing, and after you defeat her, she is revealed to be Emily, who's another friend of Yakumo's, and then Mido shows up. So Yakumo and Jack get their asses handed to them by Mido and his friends, and then Mido reveals that he actually let Eva go voluntarily. Basically, he injected something in her throat which will cause her to frenzy and thus seek out Gregorio. So he pieces out, and you go ahead in order to save Eva from her predicament and also eventually find Mido again. Find this sand place and you get to the end where you fight Eva in her weird corrupted relic form. You make your way through this crypt spire place, and then you see Mido again, who tells you that all the guys in here were actually his experiments. So he killed the two guys he seeks after you, and afterwards you can go over to him in order to beat his ass up, but before that he has to tell you all his motivations and whatnot. So basically Mido used to be a scientist who did research on revenants in order to kill the horrors that appeared in the Great Collapse. However, he used practically everyone, including children and Yakumo's orphan band of kids, in order to further his experiments. Sometimes they would die, sometimes they would be sold off as super soldiers. Basically, Mido's goal was essentially to use his research in order to accelerate the Revenant's evolution to get them to contend with the horrors of the Great Collapse. And now he's trying to kill Gregorio in order to get the red mist that keeps the horrors at bay to disappear. So he's just a mad, immoral researcher, so you go ahead and kill him because he's an asshole. But since he forced the relics of his underlings to go straight to Gregorio, then Gregorio now is about to frenzy, so you have to go ahead and stop him. So you make your way onto government property, you learn some more things about Io and the other attendant of the relics, and eventually you reach this group of attendants who will tell you that what you're doing is wrong and that you're going to make the same mistakes that everyone did and that you cannot be allowed to do so and other stuff like that. But who cares, there's nothing else to do at this point, so you just walk in and you go ahead and beat Gregorio, or at least you beat his persona, I guess. If you manage to save some of the successors, you also get to fight this abomination as well afterwards. And after that is the ending, and there are 3 of them depending on whether or not you saved some of the successors, all of them or none of them. So since I only saved some of them, I got this ending where I just sit on the throne for all eternity with Io at my side. So yeah, that's the story. It's kind of complicated, but the game does a pretty good job at explaining it. Way better than I could, so it's really not that bad. That said, I am kind of leaving a lot out as I'm mostly trying to make just the general synopsis of the overarching story. There's a lot of stuff I didn't mention in terms of small detail or character development and interactions that isn't really a part of the overarching story. If you want to know some more about the world and the characters and the background lore and all that stuff, there's another way to do it, and that's through vestiges in-game. Picking them up allows you to see some people's memories through these weird dream-like sequences. They might reveal more about some of the characters you've come to hang out with, or some characters you've heard about but never got to see because they're long dead by the time the story takes place. They might also share some details about some of the events that transpired in the past that you didn't get to see. Overall, though, I did enjoy the story, even if I feel there are some themes that could have been explored a bit more, like how certain humans are used by revenants as thralls, because once you start the search for the successors, that part becomes mostly irrelevant. All in all, I think the graphics look pretty good too, even if most of the stuff in the game has a habit of ignoring the laws of space in order to just phase through everything else around them. But I think all the areas have their own unique themes and aesthetics that make them stand out from each other most of the time, though there are a few exceptions with some areas that have similar architecture and whatnot. Also, in certain cutscenes, the characters' mouths don't actually move sometimes, which is kind of awkward. I did like the music as well, though there isn't that much to go around. For example, outside of boss fights, there's only one song for regular mob encounters, and there's kind of 3 phases to it with more intensity in each of them, but it's pretty much always the same song regardless. What matters most is that these variations in the song prevented it from becoming annoying or too repetitive. There's a couple of boss tracks as well, but there's one of them that you'll hear significantly more often than the others, so once again, didn't really get annoying, but I do wish I could have heard more of the others as well. Overall, most of the remaining tracks were used in story sequences with a few exceptions. Alright, it's time to actually start talking about the gameplay now. So since Code Vein is a Souls game, that means you can expect a lot of design quirks from other games in the genre, especially the Souls series. For instance, you have the Missile, which serve as the equivalent to Bonfire, where you can rest to replenish your health and your stock of items and also level up if you need be at the cost of reviving all of the enemies. There's also the regeneration ability, which can be used a certain amount of times in order to heal yourself, and if you want to replenish it you have to rest at a missile, and you can find certain upgrades that will make it heal you for more, or that will allow you to use it more often before having to rest to replenish it. You have your haze, which you gain by defeating enemy or using certain consumables, which acts as your experience points to level up as well as your currency to buy stuff, and if you die you'll lose it all, but you can regain it if you get to the spot where you died, otherwise they're gone for good. In combat you have light attacks that are faster but weaker, as well as heavy attacks that hit harder and can also be charged to hit even harder, and you can also block and dodge and parry and all that good stuff. Of course, there's also critical attacks that you can perform by hitting enemies in the back, as well as different types of physical damage and for different elements that you can use to give yourself the edge. And also plenty of consumables that can be used to heal you, buff yourself, or do other miscellaneous effects. So yeah, as you can see, Code Vein really has all of the basics covered, but it does manage to differentiate itself in a couple of elements, notably character building. For instance, despite being able to level up, doing so only really increases your max HP, your max stamina, and your attack power. In order to truly make your character your own and change your 6 main stats of strength, dexterity, mind, willpower, vitality, and fortitude, you'll have to do so by messing around with your blood code. Your blood code is pretty much the core of your build, since as described before, it's the one that determines what your 6 main stats are. Those 6 main stats will be what determines what kind of equipment you can use, as well as whether or not you'll have good scaling for extra damage with them or not. But your blood code decides a lot more than that, including your max amount of HP, stamina, and ichor, more on that later, as well as your resistances to certain status effects and your defense stats. They also decide your base mobility as well as your maximum equipment load, and the more equipment load you have, the slower your character becomes. Blood codes can also be swapped out at any time for absolutely no consequence, so if you want to just try out a new build where there's nothing stopping you from going for it, except maybe the fact that you won't have the appropriate equipment for it. For your equipment, you can hold up to 2 weapons that you can swap to and from at basically any time, and there's also your blood veil, which is kind of your armor. Both weapons and blood veils require you to have certain stats in order to be able to use them, so if your stats aren't good enough, then they'll become significantly less effective. Your equipment also has stat scaling, so the better you are in that stat, the better the scaling will be and make it more effective, with stats being graded via these letter grades. Blood Veils also affect your defenses as well as your drain attacks, with 4 different types of Blood Veil, each having their own separate types of drain attacks. There's actually 3 types of drain attacks, the first being critical hits, which you can do by backstabbing people or parrying them. The second are charge drains, which you can perform by holding down the A button and letting go when the attack is ready. And the third are combo drains, which you can perform by pressing the A button while holding the RB button, as long as you've already done a normal attack before. Like all other attacks, drain attacks will regen your I-core, but they will also increase your max I-core stock by 2 if they're backstabs or charge drains, or by 1 if they're combo drains. As previously explained, you can regen your I-core by hitting an enemy with any kind of melee attack, but you can also regen your I-core by guarding, both of which will give you a certain amount of I-core based on that action's drain rating. I-core is needed in order to use gifts, which are abilities that can do pretty much anything from buffing you to being spells or just attack skills. You can have up to 8 gifts slotted at any time, which you can use by holding down the right trigger and pressing one of the 4 face buttons or one of the 4 directions on the D-pad. Each gift has its own I-core cost, duration, as well as cooldown before you can use it again. There's actually another type of gifts though, which are passive gifts, which do exactly what you think. They just provide buffs as long as they're equipped on your character, and you can have up to 4 of them. You can learn new gifts by going into this menu while you're resting at a missile, though relearning them will require you to spend a little money. It is also possible to find certain items that will give you a new gift when you use them. You'll also need to make sure that you found the vestiges that are linked to this blood code in order to be able to actually learn them. Originally, gifts can only be used with the blood code they are learned from, but you can bypass this by mastering them. Mastering gifts is really as simple as killing a whole bunch of enemies while they're equipped, or you can go into the gifts menu and use some haze and these awake item thingies to master them instantly if you don't feel like killing a bunch of stuff. Be warned, however, that some gifts are unable to be mastered and you'll only be able to use them if you have the appropriate blood code equipped. And finally, there's also the focus gauge, which you can fill by either getting hit or dodging enemy attacks. Being focused makes you harder to stagger, and it also makes it easier to stagger enemies, and it also allows you to use the launch attack to actually launch enemies in the air, but I never actually ended up using it. Becoming focused also fully replenishes your stamina, which can be really useful at times if you were about to run out. Code Vein does have a multiplayer mode as well as the option of tagging along with one of your in-game NPC friends just in case you're playing alone. But because I like to suffer, I decided to completely disregard this and play practically the entirety of the game solo. So yeah, all in all, Code Vein is pretty similar to the Souls games, so if you like those, you'll probably like this one as well, unless you really hate anime. That said, there are a few things about this game that I feel weren't as polished as they were in Souls, and I think the most prevalent one of these is the backstab. Now, I know that constantly comparing this game to Souls games is probably not the best way to go about it, but for this occasion I really need you to understand how hard it is to backstab enemies in this game for some reason. Backstabbing enemies in Souls is incredibly simple. You just get behind them and you press the attack button, and sometimes whether or not you're actually behind them doesn't really matter because the game can be incredibly generous with it. Backstabs deal huge damage, they provide invincibility frames so you can't be hit out of it by other enemies, and they also stop whatever the enemy was doing before you backstab them. Backstabs in Code Vein do all of this, as well as increasing your maximum I-core stock, which makes them incredibly attractive options to go for, which makes it all the more painful that they're so hard to land. See, what the game considers the enemy's back doesn't necessarily lines up with where the enemy's back on their model actually is. Their back is actually determined by the direction they're facing, which can be kinda hard to figure out when their model shows them facing a completely different direction because of their animations. On top of that, the area that the game actually considers to be the proper area for a backstab is also pretty freaking small. All of this together means you have absolutely no consistent visual tell to figure out where you're actually supposed to aim in order to get a backstab, and this also means that it can be incredibly counterintuitive to actually figure out where you're supposed to attack them, because sometimes it's going to be exactly where you think it is, and sometimes it's going to be right in their sides. And then add to that the fact that there's no real way to know when the enemy's animation is over, which means there's also no way to know when the backstab hitbox will suddenly move away to another location. Add all of that together, and suddenly trying to go for for a backstab, looks like you're just shuffling behind the enemy, spamming the attack button in the hope it works. And this backstab problem indirectly makes another problem worse, that problem being the enemy density. Code Vein is no stranger to just throwing groups of enemies at you. It's not uncommon to run into groups of 3 or 4, maybe even more enemies at the same time, and yeah, sometimes they'll just be weak cannon fodder type enemies, but sometimes there's also going to be really strong ones. And considering how painful some of the enemies in this game can be, the wrong combination of them can really mess you up. Against groups, it's not uncommon at all to just get comboed to death because of how easy it is for enemies to stagger you in this game, and it also makes finding windows to heal that much harder, especially considering how long the healing animation is. Heck, the game even outright has a mechanic that pits you against tons and tons of enemies, and that's the invasion mechanic. Basically, there are certain spots on certain maps that will trigger invasions, where you'll get this message that pops up on your screen, and then you'll get swarmed by waves of enemies. It generally comes into a wave of 3 or 4 enemies, with 2 of them being weaker type enemies, but one of them usually being a stronger type. After killing enough enemies in the current wave, they'll immediately get replaced by other enemies, and at the end you'll have to fight one of a stronger type of enemies. Generally, these invasions basically boil down to you running around in circles trying to dodge attacks and fighting pot shots once every 2 minutes until you finally kill everything. And don't bother trying to run away from them, because these enemies will follow you and never despawn. They can even teleport up ladders to catch up with you. If you're lucky, you'll have some terrain to take advantage of, like stairs or elevated floors you can use for plunging attacks, or maybe you can find a spot that will allow you to cheese them without any effort. But even then, it's not like these things are worth seeing through to the end, because aside from the usual rewards that come from killing these types of enemies, the only thing you get is a consumable haze item, so you can use it to buy stuff, I guess. Admittedly, this large number of enemies probably isn't so bad if you're playing with a companion, AI or human, but if you're playing solo like I am, it's probably going to be very frustrating to deal with. When it comes to level design, I think most of the stages were fine overall, but there weren't really that many that stood out to me. Most of the stages were just simple mazes, but there were some of them that were a bit more complicated, either because they had their own unique gimmick, or they just had many layers that made them pretty confusing sometimes. The first real example of this for me were the dried up trenches, because there was all these places you can fall down and climb up, and all these paths that lead to other paths that you didn't take, so you kind of end up going around in big circles all the time and trying to figure out where you haven't gone and where you have gone and all that. But by far the biggest example of this is the Cathedral of Sacred Blood. It has a ton of layers with places you need to either climb up or drop down, and all of this together makes the map a complete mess because it basically doesn't tell you anything. Tons of branching pathways and moments where you either need to go find a key or a switch and then loop back around to a previous place in order to actually move on. And on top of that, it's also really freaking huge, like it's basically the biggest stage in the game by far, and combined with how confusing the layout is, it's going to be quite a challenge for any new player, especially considering this is where the enemies start becoming a lot more nasty. And all of this would have been fine if it wasn't for the fact that this is like the 5th stage in the game, so this is quite the big difficulty spike for the first time player. There are also some stages, like I said, that have their own gimmicks, like the Crown of Sand, which has all this sand that on top of slowing you down also drains your Ichor, and there's the City of Falling Flame, which has all this fire on the ground that burns your HP away when you walk on it. My personal favorite was the Crypt Spire, which is pretty similar to the Cathedral in both design and aesthetic, but being a late game area, I think the length and challenge was a lot more appropriate this time, and the stage wasn't too hard but not too easy either, and I did like the atmosphere around it as well. I didn't enjoy all of the stages. For instance, the aforementioned Crown of Sand was kind of a slog, and it had some really annoying enemies in it as well, including these guys that just shoot sand all over the place and won't stay still for a second. I didn't really enjoy the Howling Pit either. It's pretty freaking big. There's all this water all over the place that slows you down, and it's not even that hard, or at least it wasn't for me, and it was kind of just dull and boring in the end. However, the most disappointing areas in the game to me were actually the depths. The depths are completely optional areas that you can access by talking to Davis in your home base after you found their corresponding map items somewhere out in the main game. What made them so disappointing to me was that they were all incredibly similar to one another. You always start out in a big room with a missile in the center. There's always going to be a number of branching paths, one of which is locked by a door that needs a certain amount of keys. The other paths are basically just tiny parts of levels with enemies and treasure chests in them and the key that you need to find somewhere. are. At the end of these straight pathways is a boss fight, and by boss fight what I really mean is a group battle against a whole bunch of mobs, usually one strong one and a couple of weaker ones accompanying him. Once you've found the key in each pathway, you can come back to the beginning and open the locked door, which will lead you to a rematch against one of the previous boss fights in the main game. They might have slightly better stats or a different name or color palette or whatever, but otherwise they play exactly the same as their regular counterparts that you fought in the main game. And that's basically what the depths are. They're just small areas with uninteresting design that all share the same kind of design mentality. And the rewards aren't particularly interesting either, because aside from vestiges for certain blood codes and these RV masteries that let you learn gifts for free, there's basically nothing interesting around here. You can also find certain quest items or pre-transformed weapons, but quest items don't really encourage you to actually complete the area, and transformed weapons, well, you can just transform your own weapons at home base, so those aren't that big a deal either. Otherwise, all the other rewards are stuff you can just find regularly in the main game. So unless you really need some extra materials for some reason, you really don't have much of a reason to do these areas, unless you were like me and you were just curious to see what they were all about. It's not like they're even that fun to do. Most of the fights in them aren't really interesting, or in fact just straight up suck, like this fight against the two boreal brutes. If this footage looks like a complete clusterfuck mess of gameplay to you, well, that's because that's exactly what it is, and honestly, it's significantly worse playing it than it is watching it. I guess this makes it a nice segue into talking about some of the enemies that I hate, like, well, these boreal brutes, for instance. They're freakishly fast and aggressive, they hit like trucks, they have a crap ton of health, and when they get to half health, they buff themselves, making themselves even more durable and stronger. And unless you have fire or strike damage, this buff is nearly impossible to get rid of, so you're just going to have to deal with it for like 5 minutes. There's also these red guys, both variations, one of which does weird martial arts kicks and the other one just shoots you in the face with his giant cannon thing, I guess. Both of them have an attack that's incredibly fast and deals a ton of damage, so it's not uncommon to just have them walk up to you and suddenly smack you in the face with an attack that takes away half your HP without even giving you a chance to react to it. But the worst ones, in my opinion, are these Dust Cloud Bandits that you can find in the Crown of Sand. They're fast, they have a lot of different attacks, they won't stop moving all over the place, and they have an obscene amount of HP as well. When they reach half health, they conjure this storm of sand around them that drains your eye core, but most importantly, completely screws over your vision if you're trying to fight them up close. But the worst thing about them is their jump attack, where they'll go and jump in the air and fire a bunch of projectiles at the ground. If you're lucky, it'll miss you completely, but if not, it's going to melt your health bar. Otherwise, most of the enemies were fine. Some of them were pretty bland and uninteresting, and others were simply too simple to really be enjoyable to fight. Some of them have some janky hitboxes at time, and others are just straight up tanks with not much else, but if you can get a backstab on them, then you'll get plenty of time to just wail away at their HP, and most of the enemies do give you a lot of opportunities for backstab. You just have to make sure you can actually get those backstabs. As for the bosses, I thought most of them were pretty fine as well. My personal favorites would have to be the Invading Executioner as well as the Gilded Hunter. They were both really light on the gimmicks, and I think that really helped their case. They were just relatively straightforward bosses with hard to dodge fast moves that were also incredibly damaging. Well, the Executioner does inflict slow with his attacks, and you really don't want to get inflicted because the status effect sucks, especially against a boss this fast. Well, its charge attack is a little questionable because of how fast it is, so it can be pretty hard to react to it, and it's also incredibly strong, and I think there's actually 2 hitboxes on it, and if you're unlucky enough to get hit by both, your HP is just gone. But aside from those minor problems, I did think this was actually a pretty fun boss, and the fact that it's a weird, evil, pole dancing Hatsune Miku lookalike thing is also pretty funny. The Gilded Hunter is rather similar to the Executioner, but he does have one special gimmick up his sleeves, which you'll notice when he goes into phase 2 at around half HP. Once he does, he'll massively buff himself, boosting his damage, his defense, and his speed, and that's when stuff gets real. He'll become incredibly aggressive and start trying to murder the hell out of you with incredibly fast move that will absolutely decimate your HP, and your job is to survive until the buff wears off. Overall, this made him a very intense and fast-paced fight, which I really liked. So I do think he can be a little too fast at times, since being half the arena away from him and still having him be fast enough in order to come over here and smack you in the face after you try to heal is a little ridiculous. So because of that, trying to find windows to heal without just getting smacked in the face immediately after and wasting it is kind of hard in phase 2, but otherwise I think this boss was great. The other bosses weren't bad, but I feel some of them just had some problems that made them less fun than they could have been. Either it was because they had some dumb gimmick, or they were just a bit too wild for my tastes, or maybe it was even the fact that they just weren't very interesting. So yeah, that's Code Vein. It's a pretty typical Souls-like game with an anime aesthetic, but if you enjoy these kinds of games like I do, I'm sure you'll enjoy this one as well. As long as you can stomach the aesthetic, I do think Code Vein is a worthwhile game to play if you're a Souls-like fan. Just make sure that you're ready to suffer occasionally, as is the case with any Souls-like game. It's not going to go easy on you, so be prepared for that. Hey, thanks for watching this admittedly very bad video. If you enjoyed it and you want to see more of them for some reason, I do have some more you can watch right now, but maybe I'll make some more down the line, and I can promise you all the others are or will be just as bad. And if you didn't enjoy it, well, I tried my best, but hey, that's perfectly fine, so yeah, goodbye, I guess. I suck at doing this.